The first thing I noticed wasn't the sound, it was the silence. My wind chimes were gone. Those old copper chimes had been hanging beside my side garden for almost 15 years, and every evening when I pulled into my driveway, they'd catch whatever breeze wandered through our little neighborhood. That afternoon, I turned the corner after work expecting the same familiar welcome, but instead I found an excavator sitting where my flower beds used to be, a concrete truck idling in my yard, and half a dozen construction workers moving around like they owned the place. For a split second, I honestly thought somebody had made a terrible mistake. Wrong address, wrong property. Maybe the GPS sent them to the wrong house. Then I looked across the dirt and broken rose bushes and saw my neighbor standing there with his arms folded, wearing expensive sunglasses even though the sun was already dropping behind the trees. That's when I realized this wasn't a mistake at all. It was intentional. My name is Daniel Harper, and until that week I'd lived in that house for almost 19 years without a single serious problem with any neighbor. My wife and I bought the place before the neighborhood became fashionable, back when most of the homes belonged to teachers, mechanics, retired couples, and people who actually waved when they drove past. After she passed away 6 years earlier, that side garden became my therapy. Every Saturday morning, I'd be out there with a cup of coffee, pulling weeds, trimming lavender, replacing whatever the rabbits had decided to eat. It wasn't fancy, and it sure wasn't worth much money, but every inch of it carried a memory. The little stone border was something my daughter helped me build when she was 12. The rose bushes came from cuttings my wife had planted before she got sick. The old maple trees shaded the whole area every summer afternoon. To anybody else, it probably looked like an ordinary side yard. To me, it was home. Then came my new neighbor. His name was Preston Keller. He bought the house next door about a year earlier for what everybody said was just under $1 million. Nice enough house, but apparently not nice enough for him. Within weeks, there were contractors coming and going almost every day. First, it was a new swimming pool, then a giant outdoor kitchen with stainless steel appliances that looked nicer than the ones inside my own house. Then speakers hidden in fake rocks, landscape lighting bright enough to land an airplane, and finally an oversized stone patio that seemed to grow a little bigger every week. Preston wasn't a bad-looking guy, probably early 40s, always dressed like he had somewhere important to be, always talking loudly on his phone about investments, acquisitions, stock prices, the kind of person who somehow managed to make every casual conversation sound like a business meeting. We never argued before that day, but we weren't exactly friends either. Every now and then he'd make little comments that rubbed me the wrong way. "This neighborhood is changing," he'd say while looking at my older fence. "Property values are finally catching up." Or he'd laugh and tell people he planned to turn his backyard into a private resort. I figured he was just one of those guys who liked hearing himself talk. Then I walked across what was left of my garden and asked the nearest worker what exactly they were doing on my property. Before the man could answer, Preston stepped in with a smile so relaxed it almost made me question my own eyes. "Easy there, Dan," he said, holding one hand up like he was calming down an angry customer. "Everything's been surveyed. You're fine." I looked past him at the wooden forms outlining fresh concrete. "Fine?" I asked. "You're standing 10 feet inside my property." He actually laughed. Not a nervous laugh, the kind that says he genuinely thinks you're being unreasonable. "According to the updated survey, this section belongs to me. The old markers were wrong. Happens all the time." I stared at him for a second, trying to decide whether he actually believed what he was saying. "You ripped out my garden." He shrugged. "Come on, Dan. You weren't really using that strip anyway. It'll look a lot better once it's finished. Honestly, it'll improve both our property values." That sentence settled into my chest like a rock. You weren't really using that strip anyway. Funny how people with enough money start believing ownership is measured by usefulness instead of law. It wasn't about flowers anymore. It wasn't even about 10 feet of dirt. It was about somebody deciding they could erase a property line simply because they wanted a bigger place to host weekend barbecues. I didn't yell. I didn't threaten anybody. I simply turned around, walked back inside my house, and pulled every document I owned out of the filing cabinet. Original deed, county survey, title insurance, tax records. Everything matched exactly the way I remembered. My property line hadn't moved an inch since the early 1980s. The next morning, I drove straight to City Hall expecting the whole thing to be sorted out before lunch. Instead, I walked into one of the most frustrating conversations I'd ever had. The clerk looked at my paperwork, nodded politely, then pulled up Preston's recently filed survey. Well, she sighed, these don't appear to match. We'll probably need someone from the county survey office to review everything. How long? I asked. She gave me the answer nobody wants to hear. Several weeks, maybe longer depending on scheduling. I looked out the window toward the parking lot and imagined concrete drying while government paperwork sat in somebody's inbox. Preston didn't need to win forever. He just needed enough time to finish building. That evening, I drove home feeling more defeated than angry. I sat in my garage for nearly half an hour before going inside. Then, while looking around at old family boxes stacked near the attic stairs, I suddenly remembered something my late uncle had once told me years earlier, something I'd completely forgotten until that exact moment. If I had remembered those words even one day sooner, everything that happened afterward might have unfolded very differently. The memory hit me so clearly, I actually climbed into the attic before I even changed out of my work clothes. My uncle Walter had spent almost 30 years working for the county planning department, and if there was one thing everybody knew about him, it was that the man never threw away a single piece of paper. My aunt used to joke that if civilization ever collapsed, Walter could rebuild the county one filing cabinet at a time. After he passed, I boxed up most of his old maps and records without paying much attention to what was inside. That evening, I dragged down one dusty box after another until I found folders labeled with the original subdivision name. Inside were yellowed blueprints, handwritten inspection notes, utility relocation sketches, and old correspondence between developers and the county. For nearly 3 hours, I flipped through papers that looked more like history than anything useful. Then I unfolded one oversized sheet that still carried the county engineering seal across the bottom. It was the original utility easement map for our entire neighborhood. My heartbeat picked up before I'd even finished reading the title. I carried the map downstairs, spread it across my dining room table, and laid my own property survey beside it. The measurements lined up almost perfectly. Then I traced the heavy blue line marking the main sewer corridor, and it ran directly beneath the exact strip of land Preston had claimed. I checked it again because I couldn't believe something that important had been sitting in my attic all these years. Then I measured everything one more time using the survey dimensions. There was no mistake. The patio wasn't just crossing onto my property. The center section sat directly above a protected municipal sewer line, while the far edge extended over the water service corridor that public works crews legally had to access whenever repairs became necessary. It suddenly stopped being a disagreement between neighbors. It had become a public infrastructure problem, and government agencies take those a whole lot more seriously than private property disputes. I didn't celebrate. I didn't even smile. I just started working. Early the next morning, I borrowed a laser measuring tool from a retired contractor down the street named Frank, who had watched the construction from his porch all week. "You finally found something?" he asked with a grin that suggested he'd been waiting for this conversation. I simply nodded. "I think I found the right thing." Frank spent the next 2 hours helping me verify every measurement from the original steel survey pin that was still buried near the back corner of my lot. We photographed every angle of the construction, every destroyed flower bed, every concrete form crossing the property line. I recorded videos showing workers pouring concrete, while the utility map rested beside the measurements. Frank even reminded me to photograph the date stamps on my camera display because, as he liked saying, good evidence tells a story before anybody opens their mouth. By lunchtime, I had organized everything into digital folders: property records, utility easement documents, photographs, videos, measurement logs. Then I started making phone calls. First the county utilities office, then zoning enforcement. After that, public works. Finally, the building inspection department. I didn't exaggerate anything. I didn't accuse anyone of fraud. I simply explained that permanent structures appeared to have been built directly over protected municipal infrastructure and that I possessed original engineering records supporting the concern. The woman at Public Works interrupted me halfway through. "You have the original easement plans?" she asked. "Stamped by the county engineering office?" "Yes." There was a brief pause before she answered. "Email those to me immediately." Less than 2 hours later, I received confirmation that inspectors would visit the site first thing Monday morning. I slept better that weekend than I had all week, although I knew the real fight hadn't even started yet. Saturday afternoon, Preston wandered over while contractors continued laying decorative stone. He leaned against my mailbox wearing the same confident smile I'd grown to dislike. "Heard you went downtown," he said. "Hope you didn't waste too much time." I looked at him for a second before answering. "We'll see." He chuckled. "People get emotional about property lines. Happens all the time." "Maybe," I replied. "People also get emotional about sewer lines." His smile disappeared for just a fraction of a second before returning. "I have no idea what you're talking about. You'll probably find out Monday." He laughed louder than necessary, shook his head, and walked back across the yard. But something about the way he looked over his shoulder told me he'd heard enough to make him uncomfortable. Monday arrived with gray skies and steady drizzle. Around 8:33, county vehicles pulled into the neighborhood, followed by a public works truck carrying survey equipment. Every curtain on the street suddenly moved. Neighbors who normally left for work were somehow standing on their front porches holding coffee cups. Preston walked outside looking annoyed more than worried. He greeted the inspectors with the confidence of a man expecting a routine visit. That confidence lasted maybe 15 minutes. One engineer unfolded the same utility map I'd emailed over the weekend. Another located the permanent survey markers buried beneath the grass. They stretched measuring tapes across the backyard, sprayed bright orange paint across sections of the new patio, and began comparing field measurements with county engineering records. One inspector asked Preston for his construction permit package. Another requested the engineering survey used by his contractor. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody argued. Government inspections are often quieter than people expect, and somehow that makes them even more intimidating. I stood on my own porch saying absolutely nothing. There was nothing left to argue about. The measurements spoke for themselves. Around mid-morning, one of the inspectors called Preston aside. I couldn't hear every word, but I caught enough. Protected access corridor. Unauthorized permanent structure. Immediate violation. Stop work order. Preston's face changed so quickly, it almost felt unreal. The confidence drained away and was replaced by genuine confusion. He pointed toward my house several times, then toward the patio, then back at his own paperwork. The lead inspector simply shook his head and handed him several documents. Within another half hour, bright red notices had been taped to unfinished sections of the project. Construction stopped immediately. Workers began loading equipment back onto trailers without saying much to anyone. One of them quietly apologized as he walked past my driveway. "We just build what we're told to build," he said. "I know," I answered. "This isn't on you." I honestly believed that. Most of those guys were just trying to earn a paycheck. The problem wasn't the workers. It was the decisions made before they ever arrived. By early afternoon, the inspection expanded beyond the patio. Engineers discovered that portions of the outdoor kitchen had also crossed into the protected easement. Gas lines serving the built-in grill violated required utility clearances. Sections of the decorative pool deck reduced emergency access with below county standards. Every new discovery seemed to uncover another one hiding underneath it. Preston's contractor started making frantic phone calls while his attorney arrived just before lunch carrying a thick leather briefcase. The lawyer spoke privately with inspectors for nearly 40 minutes before quietly packing up his papers and leaving without saying a word to his client that I could hear. That silence said more than any courtroom speech ever could. Later that evening, Frank wandered over carrying 2 cups of coffee. We stood beside the fence watching an unfinished luxury backyard sitting completely abandoned. "You know," he said with a small grin, "some people think money fixes everything." I looked across the empty construction site where my wife's roses used to grow and answered softly, "Money fixes a lot of things. But it doesn't move laws that have been buried underground for 50 years. The following morning, I learned that the county wasn't finished yet. In fact, they had only uncovered the beginning of what would become the most expensive mistake Preston Keller had ever made. Type, continue part 3, and I'll write the final part, seamlessly concluding the story with the demolition, legal fallout, emotional ending, and a strong YouTube call to action. The county's second inspection was the one that truly changed everything. By then, Preston had hired a different engineering firm, a land use attorney, and even the survey company that had originally convinced him the extra 10 feet belonged to his property. For nearly 2 weeks, they argued over measurements, old plats, and legal interpretations. But there was one thing nobody could argue with. The sewer main and water access corridor had been recorded decades before either of us ever owned our homes. Those easements weren't suggestions. They were permanent legal restrictions, and no amount of expensive landscaping could erase them. One chilly Thursday morning, I watched from my front porch as the final determination was delivered. Preston's permits were suspended. The stop work order became permanent until every violation was corrected, and the county required complete removal of the stone patio, large sections of the pool deck, and the outdoor kitchen that had become the centerpiece of his backyard. The demolition estimate alone was staggering, and once engineering fees, permit revisions, utility inspections, and reconstruction costs were added together, people around the neighborhood quietly estimated the damage would climb well past $300,000. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The same machines that had destroyed my flower beds rolled back onto his property, except this time they weren't building his dream backyard. They were tearing it apart one truckload at a time. I remember standing by the old maple tree one afternoon as enormous slabs of custom stone were lifted into dump trucks. The pounding of hydraulic breakers echoed across the neighborhood for hours, and every strike reminded me of the afternoon I'd pulled into my driveway, believing somebody had simply made an honest mistake. Preston hardly came outside anymore. When he did, the confidence that had once filled every conversation had completely disappeared. One afternoon, he walked over while workers loaded broken concrete into a container. For a moment, I thought he wanted another argument, but instead he stood quietly near the property line and finally said, "I should have talked to you first." I looked at him for a few seconds before answering. "Yeah, you should have." He nodded without making excuses. "My survey company told me everything was fine. I wanted to believe them because it gave me what I wanted." I shrugged. "Maybe, but you didn't just trust them. You ignored me when I showed you my deed. And you tore out something you knew meant a lot to me." He glanced toward the empty patch where my garden had once been and lowered his eyes. There wasn't really anything else to say. Sometimes an apology comes too late to repair the damage, but it's still better than pretending nothing happened. Over the next several months, contractors rebuilt his backyard according to the county's requirements, although by then the project had drained far more money than he ever expected. Between construction loans, legal bills, redesign costs, HOA penalties for unauthorized improvements, and the loss in property value during the dispute, he eventually listed the house for sale. Rumor around the neighborhood was that he accepted an offer far below what he'd invested, simply because he wanted the whole ordeal behind him. A local family bought the property, finished the remaining repairs, and within weeks introduced themselves by bringing homemade cookies to every house on the street. Funny how different a neighborhood feels when people start with kindness instead of entitlement. As for my own property, the county completed an official resurvey and installed permanent steel boundary monuments at every critical corner. Public Works also updated their digital records to ensure future contractors could clearly identify the protected easement before applying for permits. I spent the following spring rebuilding the garden one section at a time. My daughter flew in for a weekend, and together we planted new roses where the old ones had been torn out. They weren't the same bushes my wife had planted all those years ago, and they never would be, but somehow watching fresh blooms appear felt less like replacing the past and more like honoring it. Looking back now, people sometimes ask if it was really worth fighting over 10 feet of land. I always give them the same answer. It was never about 10 feet. It was about the moment someone decided that money, confidence, and a polished smile mattered more than respect, honesty, and boundaries. If I had stayed quiet because it seemed easier, those 10 feet would have become someone else's truth simply because enough time had passed. Sometimes protecting what belongs to you isn't about revenge. It's about making sure the next person understands that rules exist for everyone, even the ones who think they're too successful to follow them. So I'm curious what you think. If you had been standing in my shoes, would you have fought the same battle? Or would you have let it go and try to keep the peace? Let me know down in the comments because I'd genuinely like to hear where you draw the line between being a good neighbor and standing up for what's right. And if you enjoy real lifestyle stories about property disputes, HOA conflicts, and ordinary people finding legal ways to defend themselves, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Because we've got plenty more stories where the biggest victories don't come from shouting the loudest. They come from knowing the law, staying patient, and letting the truth do the heavy lifting.